Welcome to my Warbler Paint With Me tutorial. This little warbler is the second artwork in my series of little birds. This tutorial is for my Colouring Club members. If you haven't joined yet, you can join via my website kobeanmoore.com. When you join as a watercolour member, I will send you this little bird outline and this paint palette so you can follow along with this tutorial. All you will need is 2 paintbrushes, 1 medium round and 1 small round, and 2 water dishes, 1 for washing your brush after you've used yellow and 1 for washing your brush after you've used purple. So if you have all of these things, let's get started. The first thing that we are going to do is paint the background yellow. So we want to use a lot of water and a small amount of pigment to add a very light wash of yellow across the background. The background includes all of the trees behind the bird, but I didn't paint the branch that the bird is sitting on. I later realized that it probably didn't matter if I did paint this branch yellow as well, but it's totally up to you. Either way, you can leave it white or you can add a light yellow wash across that branch as well. The reason that I originally left it white is I thought that I wanted this branch to be very dark purple, while the others I wanted them to be a little bit more of a mix between the purple and the yellow. But when I painted the branch purple, I realized that I did actually want to add some yellow to it anyway, so I added yellow later. But that is all for future steps, so I will stop rambling and continue to talk about what I'm doing now. So yeah, I'm using the medium round brush, lots and lots of water and a small amount of the yellow pigment to add a light wash across the background. The idea for the yellow is that it's a sunny day and the sun is shining from behind the trees towards the viewer. So once you have completely covered the background with a light yellow wash, we will let that dry before we start the next step. For step 2, we are switching to your small round brush. The smaller the brush, the better for this step because we are doing a lot of little fiddly details. So you can see what I am doing here is using a fairly dark shade of purple, so a small amount of water and equal amount of pigment to paint the center of each of the feathers on the back of the bird. I'm not painting the entire feather, I'm just painting the center of the shape and leaving a border around the bottom edge of the feather. What you're going to do is paint along the edge of the feather above the one that you are currently painting. So paint around the point of the feather above this one and then trace the shape of the feather that you're painting, leaving a white edge all the way around the edge of the feather. When a feather doesn't overlap symmetrically, you are just going to paint the center of that feather. Some of the feathers are very small, so you have to get in really close to the feather above it in order to leave a white border, but you don't have to be too exact with this, just try your best. Once you get to the bottom of this row of feathers, we are then going to move over to the feathers on the front wing and do the same process. The feathers on the front wing are longer than the feathers in the background, but you're still doing the same thing, painting all the way to the edge of the top and then leaving a white border all the way around the edge. For the feathers that are overlapping, we are going to still start at the top of the shape, paint all the way down the edge of the feather above it, and then as we did with all of the other feathers, you are following the shape so that you're leaving a little white border all the way around the edge. For the feathers that are just long and thin, you are just tracing the line of the feather above it and trying your best to leave another white line. This is where having a very small, fine brush is important. But don't worry too much about this because when you paint over it with yellow, these will bleed a bit anyway. So yeah, just keep following the same process until you have painted all of the feathers on the bird's wings. Once you have finished painting the wings, we are going to paint the feathers above the wings. So for these, I'm just painting around the edge of each of these little shapes. I made a small mistake here by painting on the inside of each of the lines, whereas I think it would be better if you painted on the outside of the line so that you're giving it a little bit of shadow between each of these tiny little feather pieces. But it doesn't really matter, it still looks quite good when we add the yellow later. I am using a slightly lighter shade of purple, so I've added a little bit more water so that it's a little bit lighter than the purple that I used on the wings. Then once you've finished painting the wings and the feathers above the wings, we are going to add some purple shading to the body of the bird, so painting a very light shade of purple across the belly, adding some purple to the beak, and some purple to the top of the bird's head. Then continue the shading down the back of the bird's head using a very light shade of purple. So lots and lots of water, small amount of pigment, and blend towards the center so that you get a gradient of purple to white. Then repeat this process on the other side of the bird's head underneath the beak. For the shape around the eye, what we're going to do is add darker pigment to the top of the shape and then blend that down using some water so you get a bit of a gradient where it's darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. And the final area that we're going to paint purple is down the bird's back and across the tail. So for this bit, you're using a medium shade of purple. You want it to be slightly lighter than the wings, but darker than the purple washes that you've added in other areas. And for the tail, you're following the same process that we did for the wings, where we're leaving a white border all the way around the edge of each of the shapes. And that is your base layer of purple shading for this little bird. We will let that dry before we start the next step. In step 3, we are going to paint the bird with yellow ochre. So make sure your purple shading layer is completely dry and then use the yellow ochre pigment to paint over all of the different sections of the bird. When layered, these two colours will mix and make a beautiful brown. You may notice that even though your purple layer is completely dry, when you add the yellow ochre layer, it does re-wet a little bit. And this is totally fine and actually what we want because it lets the two colours mix really well. But we don't want the purple layer to be too wet because we do want the purple areas to sort of stay in the shapes that we previously painted. So I painted the back and the tail area of the bird first. It doesn't really matter what order you choose to paint the yellow layer, but do paint it in sections instead of just adding a wash all the way over the bird, because we don't want the purple to be bleeding from one shape to another shape. We want each of the feather shapes to be contained within itself, so you keep that level of separation between each feather. So you can see what I'm doing here is following the wing shape and just painting each separate wing and each separate section with the yellow ochre. For these wing areas, I am focusing on the white area, but then I am still covering the purple with the yellow ochre because I want it to mix and make a lovely shade of brown. And then we're doing the same process for the smaller feathers around the back of the bird, just painting yellow ochre over each of these shapes. Then I painted the belly, the head, the beak, and the foot. For these areas, I did use a little bit more water, so I had slightly lighter yellow pigment than the darker pigment I was using on the wings and the other feathers. But use your judgment. Some areas you might want to add more pigment and some areas you might want to be a little bit lighter. For example, you can see I added darker around the top of the belly and I kept it light around the bottom of the belly. So yeah, just play around with it and see what you like. Then we will let this dry and start the next step. In this step, we are going to paint all of the trees or branches that are in the background. And we're going to use a light purple wash to do this. I used the small round brush to do this, but you can probably also use the medium round if you like. What we're doing is just adding purple to each of the trees. Although we are going to be painting all of the trees purple, I did paint each of the trees separately because I wanted them to be each their own individual shading. If I painted them all at the same time, then we won't get that distinction between each of the trees. So I painted one tree from the right and then I switched over to the left-hand side and let the right one dry a little bit. And then I came back to paint another tree on the right, and you can see you get this nice crisp separation between the two trees. So yeah, just keep repeating the same process until you've painted all of the background trees with a nice light purple wash. For the branch that the bird is perched on, we are going to use a darker shade of purple. So you're going to use less water and more pigment, and then we're going to paint the branch with this medium shade of purple. And while I was using the purple pigment and the small brush, I decided to paint the eye of the bird. So with the eye, I painted it with the darkest pigment that I possibly could, so a very small amount of water and lots of pigment. There are two little white dots in the eye. Try your very best to leave these white. I know they are very small, so it is a little bit tricky to paint around them. If you are finding it too difficult to paint around these little dots, and you have a white paint pen or acrylic paint, or even just a whiteout pen, you can add these little light reflections back into the eye after it has dried. In step 5, we are going to create a glow effect around all of the trees by adding a yellow ochre outline and then blending that into the background. So you can see what I'm doing is carefully tracing around the outside of each of the tree shapes and then using a little bit of water to blend that pigment so that it has a nice soft gradient from being dark around the edge of the tree and then light towards the center of the yellow shape. And then just repeat this process for each of the yellow shapes. When you have finished painting around all of the trees, you'll get this lovely yellow glow effect, as if you've got light shining in from behind the trees. Then we will let this dry before we start the next step. In this step, we are going to go back to the branches. We are going to add more layers of paint to the branches to add a little bit of differentiation between the foreground and the background trees. As I said in the beginning of this tutorial, originally I thought that I wanted the branch that the bird is perched on to be dark purple, but after looking at it for a little while, I had decided that I did want it to be a little bit more muted. So what I am doing here is adding a very light yellow wash over the dark purple branch. I don't want to turn this branch completely brown like the bird. I just wanted to make it a little bit more muted because it was just too vibrant for me. If you like yours vibrant, you're more than welcome to skip this. The next thing that I did was to add another layer of purple to the branches or trees that are in the foreground. So the idea is because the light is coming from behind the trees, we want the ones in the foreground to be darker and the ones in the background to be lighter. So the darkest branch or tree is the one that the bird is perched on. And then the 3 trees in the middle ground will be a middle tone of purple. And the 2 trees in the background will stay very light purple. I did actually come back and add a 3rd layer to this tree on the right because it is slightly in front of the other one, so I wanted to differentiate that, but it is a similar mid-tone. So it's still part of the mid-tone trees. So just to quickly recap, we have the darkest in the foreground, which is the one that the bird is perched on. We have 3 mid-tone trees in the midground, and then we have 2 light trees in the background. For final touches, we are just going to add your border. So you can choose whatever colour you like. I chose a very pale purple. So I added lots and lots of border and a small amount of pigment and painted the border purple. So then I went back to the small round brush to add in some little details on the bird. So using the purple pigment, I added some darker areas to the beak, around the head, across the eye section. These little final details are a judgment call, so it depends on what your bird looks like. I felt like I needed to add some shading around the feathers on the back of the bird, but you may not need to. It's completely up to you. Just have fun with it and enjoy the process. I can't wait to see your little warbler bird paintings. You can share them with me on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. My handle is @KobeAnnMoore. Or you can leave a review on my website with a picture. I hope you enjoyed this little warbler watercolour painting tutorial, and I will see you next month for our final bird in my Little Bird series.